Yes, I know we've all been excited about this. Dissent, Depression, and War. Here it is. Industrial warfare at home, imperialist warfare abroad. We're first going to look at the Depression part of this, which takes us to the Panic and Depression of 1893, which was one of the bigger economic downturns in our history. There were two in the Gilded Age. We didn't talk too much, a little bit, about the one in 1873. This one comes 10 years later. Looking at its impact on American society, we can look at some of the just statistics. I just picked out one statistic or series of statistics, unemployment, as indicative of the overall crisis. So you can look at numbers. They didn't have national economic statistics back then, so it's hard to put together anything too complete or simple. But if you look at that by location, it does spell a pretty large economic crisis. One railroad attorney, the famous Chauncey Depew, as it says, businessman and political fixer for the Vanderbilt railroad interests, thought that the panic had touched more people than any previous downturn. The unemployed swarmed freight trains for rides to places where there might be work. Tramps broke into schoolhouses, desperate for shelter. One thing that's, I think, striking to students when they read about this depression and others previous to this is how little the government did. At the top, I say the governor's or government's response to the depression, but it was more like lack of a response to the depression. In fact, the president at the time, you see here, Grover Cleveland, said the lesson should be constantly enforced that though the people support the government, government should not support the people, which does sound very strange to our ears today. But do keep in mind this, that it was quite mainstream thinking, going all the way back to the founding of our republic and the Constitution, that government was supposed to be limited, which in turn, to some degree, relies on John Locke, English philosopher of the late 17th century. We still hear people talk about limited government today. Some think it's a good thing. Some think government should be more active and involved, have more programs, spend more money, etc. But in those days, the idea wasn't really around yet that the government should be involved in things like social legislation, social programs. We're not far from that. It kind of starts with the progressive era where we're going next. But at the end of the Gilded Age, we're still just barely in that sort of old era, though we see some Americans here for the first time calling for the government to do more. So this is kind of a transition. The author of our text, Professor Rourke, the lovable, affable Professor Rourke, says, following the harsh dictates of social Darwinism and laissez-faire, the majority of America's elected officials believed that it was inappropriate for the government to intervene, but the scope of the Depression made it impossible for local agencies to supply sufficient relief, and increasingly Americans called on the federal government to take action. So there it is. More and more Americans start to think that the government should be in the business of getting involved in these kind of problems, passing legislation, establishing certain agencies, whatever it might be. But the government wasn't there yet, and in both parties there was a tendency still, for the time being, to think that that was inappropriate. And inappropriate, they thought it was. So it wasn't out of callousness, a lack of concern per se on the president's part or on other government officials, congressmen, and the like, but a belief that this just wasn't the way things were done. Furthermore, and this belief will continue among some political leaders and economists going forward into the 20th century, when we get there, that it actually is counterproductive or dangerous for the government to at least do too much to get involved in trying to cure the ills of an economic crisis or depression or recession, because such social engineering might not work because we don't know if it's a new program, it's a new idea put into practice for the first time. What if it doesn't work? What if it makes things worse? So that cautionary way of thinking about things was certainly in the minds of leaders like Cleveland as well, and as I said, some going forward. Coxey's army. This is an interesting story, to be sure. What was sometimes called the Commonweal of Christ in 1894, which was a direct response to the Depression. This was, as one person has said, like a petition in boots. A petition is like a document you send to Congress or some governing body for redress of grievances, saying, hey, we need help doing this, or we demand that. This is a petition in boots because it was a march on Washington, D.C. And the idea wasn't brand new, but this is kind of the first famous one. We'll see a couple more in this class in later units. So it became kind of a thing after this to march on Washington. But it was a way to put political pressure on the political system itself by taking large numbers of people. If you can get large numbers to the Capitol, you get publicity, and you might be able to air out your grievances in front of politicians, which might put pressure on them through the publicity and your presence to change the situation. The march was organized by Jacob Coxey. It's named after him, but a number of interesting figures, interesting characters showed up, and that's putting it mildly. This was in some ways kind of a carnival atmosphere, although it wasn't intended to be. Carl Brown, for instance, another one of the leaders of this march, was a character indeed, certainly an eccentric at the least. Richard White, in a book on this time period, Richard White, one of the premier historians in the U.S. today, said the extent of the suffering, the worsening desperation of working people, and the growing belief of many Americans that government had a responsibility to intervene in economic crises combined to explain the otherwise inexplicable Jacob Coxey. His devotion to monetary reform verged on fanaticism. He thought so much about money and monetary reform that you can see in the middle passage here on the screen. I asked the question, did Coxey really name his youngest son Legal Tender? And the answer to that is yes. He named his son Legal Tender. So he may have been touched in certain ways. Certainly eccentric. Brown, the other guy I mentioned, Carl Brown, I asked, did he actually think of himself as a reincarnation of Jesus, and his cohort Coxey a reincarnation of Andrew Jackson? And the answer again is yes. There was another guy along, I forget his real name, but he had more like a mask to hide his face for the entire march, the entire trip, and he referred to himself and was referred to by the press and otherwise as the Great Unknown. So there was a mystery person there. We do now know his name, but I forget who it was. But this was a strange march indeed. It had a serious purpose, but it just sort of turned in odd directions really quickly. It makes it fun to read about, certainly more so because of all the rich characters that were there. Richard White goes on to say the prospect of angry working men converging on Washington alarmed the administration, but the press characterized the march as less a revolution than a circus coming to town, which was probably more accurate and correct given the things I've just said and many things I haven't. So Coxey believed he was going to get tens of thousands of people. In the end, it was far short of that, but they did march all the way from Ohio, where Coxey was from, to Washington, D.C., but the march, as I say on the screen, entered with a whimper when Coxey and Brown were arrested for demonstrating on the Capitol grounds and damaging shrubs and lawns. However, and again, quoting the same source, Coxey's policy ideas were not outlandish. Many would eventually become law and were already becoming public policy even as they were ridiculed. So as strange as this march was, it was serious, and Coxey, to some degree, had some serious ideas that the government was already entertaining. But maybe more than anything else, this relates to the previous slide, and that is that it's a sign and a symbol of the people starting to claim and starting to believe that the government isn't playing a large enough role in crises. So Coxey, in a sense, was saying, well, I'm going to have to kind of do this my own way. We're going to have to put pressure on the government from outside because they don't seem to be taking up the ball themselves. Raise less corn and more hell. The populist movement and America's farmers. So that's a quote from a famous speech by the woman you see in the bottom right, Mary Elizabeth Lease, a populist leader who was known for making fiery speeches, although there were many populists that were known for making fiery speeches. But we have to start by saying that the populist movement here at the end of the Gilded Age was a movement of America's farmers. Not all of them, but many of them who joined this movement. And I say that because the word populist is in the news all the time today and defined in different ways, so it can be kind of confusing. And we're going to deal with that in a few minutes because a general definition of populist kind of applies across the centuries, which is what I have for you coming up. But we shouldn't forget that in this particular case, in the Gilded Age, when we talk about populists, we're talking about the plight or the self-perceived plight of the farmers. So were the populists a force for good or not? Good or bad? So I've asked the question very simply, and I'm relying on two well-known historians on the subject to take the pro side, the con side. Lawrence Goodwin, in a book known as The Populist Movement, probably the most eloquent defense of the populists, defender of the populists in Goodwin's career as a professor, said, out of their cooperative struggle came a new democratic community. It engendered within millions of people what Martin Luther King would later call a sense of somebodyness. This sense was a new way of thinking about oneself and about democracy. Thus armed, the populists attempted to insulate themselves against being intimidated by the enormous political, economic, and social pressures that accompanied the emergence of corporate America. To describe that attempt is to describe their movement. So, in certain ways, that little passage there doesn't directly say that it's taking a very positive, optimistic, or laudatory, I should say, approach to the populists. But if you read that carefully enough, it's pretty clear that he is coming from a very pro-populist, pro-farmer perspective. I read the book in graduate school, so I do know that that's true. The con side was taken up by, among others, one of the most famous historians in our history, Richard Hofstadter. Both of these guys are now deceased. Hofstadter was an earlier historian even than Lawrence Goodwin, but in a very famous book, The Age of Reform, which only had a chapter on the populists, Hofstadter said in one spot, where else in American thought in this period do we find this militancy and nationalism, these apocalyptic forebodings and drafts of world political strategies, this hatred of big business, bankers, and trusts, these fears of immigrants and urban workmen, even this occasional toying with anti-Semitic rhetoric. So Hofstadter is known, it's well known amongst historians anyway, that Hofstadter had these kind of negative things to say, and very critical things to say about the populist movement, the farmers. So Goodwin takes the pro-populist position. Hofstadter famously takes the anti-populist position. Hofstadter's arguing that they were in a way sort of selfish bigots trying to blame others for their own problems. Not that the problems were always their own fault, or usually their own fault, but still nonetheless sees them as sort of a dangerous force in many ways. Lawrence Goodwin went so far as to say that the populists, the farmers, pulled together and formed a subculture that was a very healthy and democratic one, that they helped each other out, and which is somewhat true. They developed a sense of community and had all kinds of picnics and social gatherings that were designed to bring solidarity to farmers, to keep their spirits up during difficult times, like the Depression that we just talked about, but also to share information and to educate themselves, and make their get-togethers political as well, political activism. So what is populism? Since it's a widely misused and often quite vague word, especially today. So this isn't the only way to break it down, but I'm going to just read this, my own writing anyway. Anger by a group at the establishment, the establishment institutions, or groups or individuals of the establishment, claiming that the system is keeping them from success. Whatever system it is, capitalist system or the democratic capitalist system, they see themselves as outsiders, though they consider themselves insiders in the sense of being the true citizens and patriots in the country. But they see themselves as outsiders in another sense because they're not the establishment, and they often view their opponents as enemies, sometimes vilifying those perceived as enemies. Also, there are attempts by populists to go around the establishment institutions, banks and insurance companies, etc., sometimes government itself, to achieve success, and doing so through a collective ethos. So there is a tension in populism, both then and now, but at least in America, between individualism and individualistic values and sort of the collective nature of populism. Also, they sometimes fixed on a leader, populists then and now fix on a leader who they believe can go around the system with a mass movement of the outsider group behind him. So oftentimes this collective energy of outsiders taking on the establishment and the system, trying to bring it down or take control of it, will fix on a leader who they think can get it done for them, and they'll loyally follow that leader. Populists are often critical of others or government support of others, i.e. immigrants and other groups, who they see as unwelcome competitors or people not deserving of the same rights as the true citizens in which the populists see themselves, the true Americans as populists see themselves. So I've tried to put that definition there in a way that wasn't laden with value judgments. It might come across as looking like I'm criticizing populism per se, but I'm actually not. This is an attempt to try to make it sort of neutral so it can it would fit whether you think positively of populists then or now or do not. Because I think we'll see at least the populists in the late 19th century who were farmers, there was a lot there's a lot, I think, in here that makes us sort of feel for them and makes us see why they would be thinking the things that they were. Farmers were up against it in the Gilded Age. We next look at the major populist grievances against the system. And I ask, why did they think the system was rigged against them, and was it rigged against them? And of course I use the word rigged partly because it's a sort of trigger word at the moment, used in politics now. You know what I'm talking about. We don't have to get into that. Or you will if you remember that once people watch this lecture, I don't know, a year from now and beyond. Nonetheless, rigged, I think, is sort of a useful word because we all know what we're talking about here because of what I just said. So I've just boiled it down to a few of their demands, a few of their grievances. We'll talk about some more briefly as we go along. And this might sound strange coming from farmers who we think of as uneducated guys in overalls and a pitchfork, although that's not always accurate, of course. They demanded an increased money supply. either the free coinage of silver or free coinage of silver, which meant keeping the gold standard in place, which was in place at the time, which meant that the amount of money in circulation had to be pegged to a certain percentage or proportion of gold held in the U.S. Treasury vaults in reserve. So there had to be a certain percentage of gold to back up any increase in money supply. And the farmers, the populists, who wanted more money in circulation for reasons that we'll see, they thought if we coin silver, mint silver, right? Silver has the same kind of value as gold, though not quite as valuable, but it could do the same thing. They would just be on the country would be on a two-metal standard, what some actually referred to at the time as bimetallism, two metals. And so whatever the amount, dollar value of silver that got added to the U.S. Treasury gold, then they could increase the money supply by that much. There were other populists had a more radical idea, and that was just leave the gold standard entirely and print money as needed. That doesn't mean that they were saying that the government should just print money 24/7. There would be, by their own standards, oversight, government officials, economists, etc., sort of looking at when it's right and when it doesn't make sense to increase the money supply, when to tighten it, when to loosen it, but nonetheless not base it on any kind of gold standard whatsoever. We'll come back to that, an example of this in a minute. They also, wait a minute, I'm going to do that now. I'm sorry. So let's use, I thought I had this on here. I don't. Let's use the hackneyed, overused, cliched, deserted island example. So say you have 10 people, marooned on a deserted island. And when they get there, there's a few palm trees or coconut trees, and they have to eat, and so they have to have an economy, and their entire economy is coconuts. They live on the beach or near the beach, and every year they're able to produce 10 coconuts. So they have 10 people, 10 coconuts. Now this is hypothetical, of course, because one coconut per person per year wouldn't allow you to survive. So just bear with me. And when they got to the island, they went through their pockets and found that they had 10 $1 bills. So 10 people, 10 coconuts, 10 $1 bills. So to make the analogy here, the people represent the population of the United States. The coconuts represent the size of the economy, and of course the dollar bills represent the money supply. So it's 10, 10, and 10. And with the 10, 10, and 10 matchup there, what do you have to sell each coconut for if you're going to buy and exchange them in the marketplace? $1. But let's say over time, the people double. I don't know how that happens, but populations sometimes rise. My parents told me at some point when I was younger. I kind of forget. But let's say, I don't know, 25, 30 years later, the population, 50 years later, is at 20 now instead of 10. So 20 people, and because there's more people, more mouths to feed, but also more workers, they're able to produce 20 coconuts now a year. So there's 20 people, 20 coconuts, but let's say for some reason they're kind of dense or hard-headed or traditional, and they haven't thought of a way or wanted to move to a way that used something beyond the 10 $1 bills they arrived with, and so the money in circulation is still only $10. So it was 10, 10, and 10. Now it's 20, 20, 10. And if that's the case, then the coconuts have to sell for 50 cents a coconut, or things don't work out. So prices then are going down through this process. And this is what was happening. I've given you a microcosm, of course, and real hypothetical, but the population was going up in the Gilded Age. The economy was growing by leaps and bounds in the Gilded Age, as we already know, industrial capitalism, but the gold standard was more or less keeping the money supply the same, which had the effect of essentially driving down prices. And so farmers were keenly interested in increasing the money supply because they thought it would bring their prices back up, and in a way that allowed them to do better. But of course, the bankers, who were largely supported by the Republican Party and vice versa, were adamant about staying on the gold standard. They tended to believe that not only was it bad economics, bad for the economy, but that it was somehow kind of immoral and rash, dangerous to leave the gold standard. And so you kind of know how this is going to turn out. Picture a farmer in overalls versus J.P. Morgan, who's going to win that contest. Okay, so we kind of already know how that's likely to work out. But this is why the farmers are so keenly interested in the money supply and increasing it. Their second big grievance was a demand that something be done about what they considered gouging middlemen, mostly railroads and grain storage and elevator companies and facilities, an example of which you see in the upper right. The big tall building is a grain elevator. Grain is stored there for whatever amount of time is necessary before it's loaded onto trains in special cars. So why are they so angry at the middlemen? Here's where I think you can really see that the farmers had some legit grievances. I mean, not all, maybe not all of their ideas for changing things, or any of them, were good or appropriate. But I think you can see that there's something to their, their concerns. That's putting it mildly. The word concerns. So middlemen, in what sense? Well, a farmer, if he was, say, growing corn, couldn't get his corn to market without the railroads, and couldn't get it to market without the grain storage facilities. And so those businesses in rural areas where farmers are located had farmers over a barrel. They could basically charge whatever they wanted because there wasn't usually any or much competition. A farmer in somewhere in the middle of Texas, right? There might only be one railroad close to his farm, and so if he doesn't like their prices, his crop, his corn will rot. So the railroads don't really have any or much competition. If you were a farmer near, just outside of a large city, or even decent-sized town, there might be more than one railroad going through your area, and there might be a little bit of competition that drives prices down, but there wouldn't be a lot. And the same holds true. What I just said holds true for the grain storage and elevator companies as well. Could charge kind of what they want. So farmers are being gouged and it's tough for them to make a profit because the middlemen here just jack up the rates, and oftentimes they would know what the how much a farmer individually and how much farmers in general were likely to make in a given year, from the quality of the crop to the competition from around the world, from other farmers, etc., etc. And so if they knew the farmers were going to have a good year, or thought they were, they could step in and just raise prices and basically pocket the profit that the farmer thought he was going to make, more money than he made last year. But no, it's the middlemen that come in, raise the prices, and they basically pocket the money that the farmer thought he was going to, increase his profits by. So this is definitely an understandable problem. So they demand that something be done about middlemen so that farmers don't have to deal with such problem. Farmers also had difficulty acquiring credit and difficulty paying it off on those rarer occasions when they did. So they wanted something to be done about in the direction of easing credit. They also called for certain industries to be nationalized. The one in the end that they wanted to be nationalized more than any other were the railroads. So in the bottom right, it's kind of hard to see. I wish I had a better version of that, but it's a political cartoon about the railroads sort of having a huge impact, or having a huge power over the farmers. And actually the caption, which isn't in there, says, which will win, the farmer or railroad monster? Well, we kind of already know the answer. Again, I used J.P. Morgan, well, he was a railroad guy too, as well as a banker, so we know who's likely to win that battle. The heart and soul of the populist movement. I mean, the populist movement, to its core, really came out of the Farmers Alliance, founded in or around 1877 in Texas. There was eventually a Western Farmers Alliance, a Southern Farmers Alliance, and there was a Black Farmers Alliance. You see a picture of one of their meetings in the lower center there. But there were some places where blacks and whites in the populist movement or in the Farmers Alliance worked together in some counties, for instance, but not overall. So there was still segregation and due to racism in parts. And this is one of the, I think, biggest flaws in the populist movement, the Farmers Alliance, again, being its heart and soul, in that racism helped keep them from achieving a lot of their goals because of the lack of unity that it brought. Mass movements, and this populist movement is a mass movement, meaning masses of people, kind of a bottom-up movement, pressure from below on society. But mass movements do well by the principle of strength in numbers, which we'll see in the labor movement, because it's true there as well. So by not allowing African Americans into the other farmers' alliances, it violated the principle of strength in numbers. So farmers, not all, but many of their own, especially in the South, many of their own prejudices got in the way of their movement succeeding. Partly what Richard Hofstadter was criticizing in the quote that I already read you. So the Farmers Alliance, I said it's the heart and soul of the movement, but what did it do? Well, it gave the farmers, as an organized group, an institutional base and power structure. So it's partly what made them into, turned them into an organized group. So having an institution or institutions for any kind of movement to get anything accomplished is crucial. It's of the essence. So the main institutional base of the populist movement was the Farmers Alliance. The Farmers Alliance also created its own, or their own, insurance programs, buying and selling cooperatives. See a farmers cooperative creamery pictured there in the center of the screen. There was something called the Great Texas Exchange that didn't survive, by the way, didn't last that long, but it was an interesting idea. It was a buying and selling co-op. Buying because instead of farmers, let's say 10 farmers in one county needed a new plow, instead of each of them wasting their time, right, and resources and transportation, going out and buying their own plow, they would already have a purchasing agent, and that purchasing agent would go out, on his own, so it would save everybody else we'd say the gas today, and time. They could put their time into other things. Well, that person was buying it for them, but because they were buying in bulk, they sometimes could get things at wholesale, not retail prices. So there are all kinds of advantages in sort of buying things collectively, together. Again, a lot of this movement is collective, cooperative, as we've already noted. The Texas Exchange was also a selling co-op. The farmers bulked their crops, as it was known, which meant that instead of the farmers, once again, transporting their goods to market on their own, they put it in one shipment with somebody in charge of it, and shipped their stuff off to market sort of all in one big shipment. They didn't divide up the profits evenly, so if you were a farmer and you put 65% of the shipment, corn or wheat, whatever it was in there, you'd get 65% of the profit. But nonetheless, there were savings in terms of efficiency in doing things this way. But a lot of these things didn't work in the end, or didn't survive in the end. There were insurance schemes, etc. You can see an advertisement for that in the upper right of the screen here. Also of great importance, the Farmers Alliance educated farmers about economics and politics. At one point, they had something like 35,000 lecturers fanning out into rural communities all across the South and the Plains states, Midwest, sort of the big farming states at the time, and educating them, holding kind of informal classes about economics, politics, what they were up against in trying to fight the system, to force the system to take their demands, their grievances into account. A guy named Charles McCune, a Texas farmer and leader of the Farmers Alliance there, eventually came up with an idea, which hereafter was known as the Sub-Treasury Plan. And the farmers here, you can see, are trying to, in a sense, do an end run, or a series of end run, around the institutions of government and the capitalist system. So in some ways, this is a way to go around the system, or at least what they'd done before had been. So the Great Texas Exchange, as an example, was an attempt to not have to do insurance, by going to a powerful, wealthy insurance company. So the first step, the first strategy of the populist movement, the Farmers Alliance, was to create their own institutions, which we've just seen showed some good ideas, but none of them really worked in the end. There was a lot going against them, including the banks, who were unwilling to loan them money, partly because farmers were a credit risk. Oftentimes, farming can be very precarious and unpredictable, but also because the bankers realized that the farmers are trying to do an end run around us. They're trying to avoid us. They're trying to borrow money from us now so they'll never have to again. And bankers don't want that. They want farmers and everybody else to go straight through them to get anything done all the time, to have no choice but to go to the bankers. So the second step, after kind of their own institutions failed, for the most part, was trying to go to Washington, D.C. and pressure, lobby politicians to get things done that benefited the movement, the farmers. So it was Charles McCune. That's the most famous example of this. His sub-treasury plan saw him go to Washington, D.C. to try to sell it, lobby congressmen to get this passed into law. He thought it would, help the farmers economically immensely. So what was the plan? Could it have succeeded? Why didn't it happen? Well, the plan, as you see in the red and white, a federal examiner, there'd be sub-treasuries, these buildings in every county or all over the state, in every state, farming state, and a farmer would bring his crop to that federal facility, and there would be an examiner on hand that would evaluate the farmer's crop, price it, look at the market value of it, estimate it. The farmer could borrow then 4/5 of the value of what the crop was valued at 1% interest. So it was a way to get credit, right? It was also a way to put more money in circulation, because the farmer borrowing at the point of contact there with the federal examiner, right? That's new money being created. The government would then store the crop. The farmer would retain ownership, and now the crucial to this, the farmer can now wait to sell his crop until the prices are more favorable. So if you think about it, we talked primarily in the earlier slide about 3 major grievances: the money supply, the middlemen, right, and the money supply, the middlemen, and the debt sort of issue, not being able to get credit. And all of those sort of are tied up in one. So this was killing three birds with one stone. At least that was the effort. So it was ingenious in many ways. The trick was selling it to Congress. And whether it could have succeeded or not is not entirely clear. But why it didn't happen in the end is that, simply put, McCune and the Farmers Alliance couldn't get enough congressmen interested in it to get it passed into law. He got a handful or few congressmen interested, but never enough to even get the sub-treasury plan or the bill accompanying it or drawn up around it onto the floor of either the House or the Senate for a vote. It got stuck in committee and never got out of there. Most bills, by the way, even today, don't see the light of day. They don't even get to the floor for all the congressmen, senators, members of the House to vote on them. Most of them are killed in committee. And so this had tepid support, not enough to even get voted on up or down by the full Congress. So now the Farmers Alliance, Populist Movement have tried two different strategies. They've both basically failed. The first, again, create their institutions to go around the system, to go around the mainstream. And second, to lobby and try to convince politicians to do their bidding for them, to put legislation through that would assist the farmers and make conditions better for them. And the third and final strategy, was to form their own political party. This became known as the People's Party. And as they were sort of forming the People's Party in 1892, they got together. Mainly, this is a Farmers Alliance product again. So remember what I said, and it says it on one of the slides. The Farmers Alliance as an organization was the heart and soul of the populist movement. So they were even mainly behind the People's Party, a third party that they created to get into politics. So if you can't form your own institutions to go around the mainstream, the system, if you can't get politicians to reform the system, then elect your own politicians, loyal to your ideology and to your concerns, and put them in office. So the third party, the People's Party, and the Omaha Platform. The Omaha Platform put forward a number of proposals, some of them radical, as we'll see. But here we see the preamble to it, written by Ignatius Donnelly, one of the major leaders of the People's Party. And Donnelly says, these words are famous. It's the first part of the Omaha Platform. The group met in Omaha, Nebraska, and drew up the party's first platform. Platform, by the way, is, for those of you that may not know, is sort of the word we use to put to talk about a political party's program, right? What their goals are, what their main emphasis is on issues, etc. So the platform. Donnelly writes, "The conditions which surround us best justify our cooperation," meaning, again, collective cooperation by the farmers. "We meet in the midst of a nation brought to the verge of moral, political, and material ruin. Corruption dominates the ballot box, the legislatures, the Congress, and touches even the ermine of the bench. The people are demoralized. Most of the states have been compelled to isolate the voters at the polling places to prevent universal intimidation and bribery. The newspapers are largely subsidized or muzzled, public opinion silenced, business prostrated, homes covered with mortgages, labor impoverished, and the land concentrating in the hands of capitalists. The urban workmen are denied the right to organize for self-protection. Imported pauperized labor beats down their wages," meaning immigrants for the most part. "A hireling standing army, unrecognized by our own laws, is established to shoot them down, and they are rapidly degenerating into European conditions. The fruits of the toil of millions are boldly stolen to build up colossal fortunes for a few, unprecedented in the history of mankind, and the possessors of those, in turn, despise the Republic and endanger liberty. From the same prolific womb of governmental injustice, we breed the two great classes, tramps, and millionaires. Well, inspiring, dramatic, emotional words for sure. Well written, and you could see how somebody, suffering as a farmer, as part of this movement, would be truly inspired by hearing those spoken or, reading them themselves. So, as I ask in red, is there a problem with this use of language? Well, it depends on your perspective, but I think it seems fairly clear that if the goal was to achieve popularity with the public, and most mass movements, whatever group it is, generally need the support of kind of mainstream middle-class America if they're to get very far. This wasn't likely a thing to do it. It's melodramatic. It's certainly that. It overstates things. It exaggerates some of these things. Many of them were serious problems. It wasn't this is entirely wrong. It's just that the volume is turned up too loud on this. So keep in mind this was written in 1892. That's the year before the Depression started. So the economy was actually doing well, or at least much better than Depression. So this isn't even said or written in Depression economic downturn-like conditions. Even the last, or especially the last sentence, allows us to see some of this. From the same prolific womb of governmental injustice, we breed the two great classes, tramps and millionaires. Tramp was a word for like homeless person in those days. So he's saying, or they're saying, the only two real classes in the country are homeless people and millionaires. And again, some people who heard about this, read it in the newspaper, may have realized it's exaggerating to make the point. It's hyperbolic to touch a nerve. But nonetheless, to say without qualification that we basically have two classes in the country: millionaires and homeless people. That leaves the overwhelming majority of people reading this scratching their head saying, "Wait a minute, I'm not homeless and I'm not a millionaire. I'm in between. So where do I fit in this scheme of things?" Well, according to this very stylized, rhetorical, polemic and polemical style, you wouldn't be able to relate to this. So this is what I think is the problem with this use of language. It's not designed to appeal to the broad masses of average, particularly white, middle-class Americans. So the People's Party formed 1892, Omaha platform we just saw same year, and when all else fails, form a political party. Their first two strategies failed, and now they form a party. Among other demands they make, and the Omaha platform really is a series of demands. They called for a graduated income tax, which we have today, but it was a fairly radical idea at the time. Nationalization of the railroads, which is a radical idea all of the time. There are capitalist countries that have nationalized, even today, certain industries here and there. But it is a socialist idea, at least one socialist idea. Now, if your whole economy is nationalized, then you have a socialist economy. But they were calling for just one industry in the end. They talked about other industries before, but calling for just one now, the railroads, to be nationalized. But still pretty radical. Free coinage of silver, which means sort of leave the gold standard by adding silver to gold. Mainstream Americans were probably not wild about this. Certainly rich Republican bankers and politicians were not. They wanted the direct election of senators. Remember, remember that it's not until the progressive era that we're going to get to about 10 years later that we see as an amendment to the Constitution the direct election of senators. In the original Constitution, going back to 1787, the two senators for each state were selected by the politicians in the state house. So the state government, state legislators chose the two senators, not the voting public of that state. But they're demanding here, the farmers through the People's Party, the Omaha platform, that the public, in voters in each state vote for their senators. And they're also calling for an 8-hour workday maximum. So this is a seriously radical agenda. As one historian says in a current book, more radical than anything on offer from the labor movement. And we're going to get to the labor movement. You might think that the labor movement, workers going out on strike and stuff, would be more radical, but in this case, this is, I think, more radical than at least than what the mainstream of the labor movement is pushing for. So the next stage of the populists, farmers' alliances, difficulties and attempts to overcome them comes when the 1896 election that pitted this guy, William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic nominee for president, with a guy we'll see shortly, William McKinley, the Republican nominee. Jennings Bryan was a politician from Nebraska, one of the major farm states, a lot of Farmers Alliance members in his state, and he knew it and sort of played this up. And he kind of became at least in mainstream politics, the champion of the farmers and their various causes. And at the 1896 Democratic Convention, he made one of the greatest speeches in American history, known as the Cross of Gold speech now. And this does have a high place in American history. It's probably usually considered to be one of the top 3 or 5 political speeches ever in our history. And there's quite a bit of competition to be in the top 3 or 5. So this was a great speech indeed. And he was known for being a gifted orator. Actually had a storied career even beyond this. He served in a number of capacities at the federal level and ran for president more than one time. So he was known as the Great Commoner, this is his nickname, because he was taking on the interests of the common people, and he came from a common background. The populists, the farmers, were average folks for the most part. So he said, there are 2 ideas of government. There are those who believe that if you just legislate to make the well-to-do prosperous, that their prosperity will leak through on those below. The trickle-down theory. The Democratic idea, the other one, has been that if you legislate to make the masses prosperous, their prosperity will find its way up and through every class that rests upon it. Which is a little strange way to sort of think of this, but it does show that, at least rhetorically, and maybe in all seriousness, he was for the masses and kind of like Bernie Sanders railing against the 1%. The most famous passage from the Cross of Gold speech, which got rave reviews at the time and ever since. He said, having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. Wow, those are brilliant words, and he bellowed them out brilliantly by all accounts. But he's using some clever literary devices here, or speaking devices, oratory devices. Number one, maybe most obviously, right? Crown of thorns, crucify, cross of gold. He's conjuring up religious images, Christianity, the crucifixion of Jesus. And so what he's really getting at and saying, he's saying, you're trying to nail Americans, average Americans, farmers, and other struggling Americans. You're trying to nail them to a cross of gold. Meaning you're trying to make them stuck with the gold standard that doesn't work for them. It only works for the bankers. But we're not going to let you crucify us on a cross of gold. So I think you can see the power in that speech. So Bryan was a serious contender for the White House. I mean, he was the Democratic nominee, but in some ways he was an underdog and an outsider. Even though he'd been a congressman, he certainly campaigned here as an outsider. But it put the Farmers Alliance and the People's Party, the Populist Movement, in a bind, because in the previous election in 1892, just after they formed the party, the People's Party actually ran a presidential ticket, a presidential and vice presidential nominee. Now, of course, they got a tiny percentage fraction of the vote, but they had planned to run a ticket again, another third-party candidate. But after William Jennings Bryan got nominated, he made it clear that the number one issue that he was running on for president was the free coinage of silver. As the cross of gold speech, in a way, already implies. So the People's Party could have had two choices now. They could either once again put together their own package of presidential and vice presidential candidates, which they knew for sure would lose, so they wouldn't get any of their program put into law because they wouldn't have the guy as president. Or the People's Party, like the Democrats, could also nominate William Jennings Bryan, and if he won, there was at least a chance that he'd be able to come through, push through the free coinage of silver, which is only one of their ideas, but an important one. And if Bryan won, the presidency, coming from the Democratic Party, one of the two mainstream parties, there was a realistic chance that they might get one of their big issues into law in their favor. So it was really a no-brainer. There was quite a bit of debate about it. Many of the older members of the Farmers Alliance thought it's going to water down our purity of our cause, because we're going to have to sort of forget, at least for the time being, all of our other core important issues and put those aside just to focus on free coinage of silver. Nonetheless, the practical thing to do was what they did do in the end, and that's nominate William Jennings Bryan, who then became the nominee of two parties in 1896. However, he ran into a very difficult obstacle, and it's not so much William McKinley on the left, who won the presidency that year over Bryan, McKinley being the Republican nominee, but the guy on the right, his campaign manager, Mark Hanna, who was a force, sometimes even referred to as the kingmaker, in what is often sometimes been called the first modern presidential election. I put that with a question mark because, of course, that's open to argument. We'll see kind of what's modern about it as we go forward. Kingmaker is used in other times in history, but it's the person sort of behind the scenes that is the one responsible for putting someone in power, not the person sort of that's sitting on the throne or sitting in the Oval Office of the White House. In this case, Mark Hanna is probably the main reason, if we have to boil it down to a person, that McKinley did win in 1896. Hanna was an extremely successful multimillionaire businessman, and he ran the political campaign of McKinley as a business. Everything was sort of organized. They canvassed all parts of the country. A ton of money was spent, much more so than Bryan's campaign, which wasn't organized in anything like that kind of effective, efficient way, which is part of the reason that McKinley does indeed win. Hanna would go on to become a major government official and elected official in his own right. But as H.W. Brands, one of my favorite historians, he's prolific in the subjects he writes about in U.S. history, in a fairly recent book, says, for love or money, Hanna began grooming McKinley for the presidency. He mined his own bank account, busying himself prepping McKinley for 1896. The two held late-night policy sessions, and Hanna arranged for McKinley to appear in public as often as possible. He advertised McKinley as if he was a patent medicine, groused Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt grumbled about the way McKinley was being packaged, like he was a commodity on sale. Hanna gathered a small group of capitalists who nominated themselves trstees for McKinley and took control of his finances. They urged other capitalists to join the McKinley bailout. Henry Clay Frick gave $2,000. George Pullman and Philip Armour $5,000 each. Hanna purchased publicity promoting McKinley as the advance agent of prosperity, and he sent McKinley on a tour around the country. Hanna's mastery of the political process allowed McKinley himself to shut down anything that smacked of deal-making. Hanna and the party professionals wished to be as vague as possible, relying on the Depression to defeat the Democrats. So there's a lot of things in that quote which I don't have time to unpack for you, but you can see, at least at the end there, Hanna's subtlety. He was sort of a great behind-the-scenes operator, but he realized that we don't need to be out there having McKinley to be too loud about the issues. Being kind of vague on them would be fine, because the Depression on its own is causing so many Americans to question the Democrats, because Grover Cleveland, Democratic president, was in power, that as long as the Depression goes on, right, it's going to get blamed on the president in office, which generally happens, whether fair or not, true or not. But so Hanna ran an incredibly brilliant campaign in terms of strategy and the amount of work that he put into making sure McKinley got into the White House. In the end, however, the vote was pretty close. William Jennings Bryan could have won, had a couple of states sort of went a different way, and it was by no means clear that his kind of insurgent, in a way, kind of populist campaign, I didn't say this, but he sort of became a mainstream version of a slightly outsider politician sort of running against the system. So kind of became kind of the populist type leader, right, that they sort of fall behind and use to sort of go around other institutions of government. And that's sort of how Bryan campaigned. And the election was close enough that it wasn't clear that that couldn't succeed at some point in the future. So it's an interesting precedent in some ways, or potential precedent. We now move to the labor movement. Its rise from 1865 to 1900. There had been, of course, unions and strikes before this, but the movement really comes into its own and becomes sort of a big part of the economy during this period for the first time. And I start with the question, isn't labor history boring? It certainly sounds like it. Strikes and unions, negotiating and signing contracts, and well, it can be that, but America's labor history is rich, and it's partly because it's a quite violent labor history. So the labor movement itself can be seen as a mass movement. The populist movement was a mass movement of farmers. Right? Mass movement means kind of grassroots, masses from below, putting pressure on those above them. The system itself, they're pushing from below to try to change that system. So the labor movement were workers in the cities, sort of doing the same thing. And the importance of strength in numbers, the principle of strength in numbers is operative again. The sharper of the labor leaders, many of them recognized the more unity we have, the more solidarity we have amongst workers across different industries across the country, across skill levels, the more clout we have in our hands. I asked the next question here, what is a picket line? And it's funny because today, when I think if you say picket line, people picture, and I do too sort of, like 12 people walking in kind of an elliptical, round and round in front of Safeway, employees on strike saying, don't, the signs that read, don't shop here, Safeway is unfair to its employees, whatever it is. And they just kind of walk around and people still go into the store, but it's all very peaceful and kind of calm and not that dramatic. Well, maybe there were some of these in the Gilded Age, but the famous labor conflicts, three of which we're going to talk about here, you see on the screen, were anything but dull. These were in many ways all-out wars, and I mean violent wars with casualties and death and wounded on both sides. So this was being taken seriously, and I'll give you an example of this. the picket line itself during the Gilded Age. So the picket line wasn't, in these at least bigger famous strikes and labor disputes, it wasn't just 12 people walking with signs. The picket line was usually kind of in front of the factory entrance, and the strikers were blocking the entrance, that's the picket line, because they know much of the time that the owners, managers of the company, are going to try to get replacement workers, temporary or otherwise, into the factory to get production going again, because the factory, the company, is losing money every day they're not producing anything. And oftentimes they're brought in with armed guards, see sort of on the lower right, sort of troops of armed guards, sometimes state militia, once in a while federal troops, sometimes private sort of security agencies. Nonetheless, scab workers, replacement workers, are sometimes brought in by armed guard. So these picket lines were often front lines of battles. So let's say there's not strike-breaking troops present, but hypothetically, if a group of scabs is walking up to the picket line, and one guy comes face to face with another, a scab versus the guy who's striking, that guy that's striking probably isn't going to ask the scab quietly and nicely, "Hey, Mr. Scab, would you please not cross the picket line and go in there to work, because if you do that, we're less likely to get what we're demanding, better wages, etc., and just get fired. You'll replace me, and I can't afford that. I have a wife and kids at home, and I've got a mortgage to pay and food to put on the table. Could you just please not go in?" That's not what's going to happen, right? A lot of these guys were armed, sometimes with guns, more likely with knives, baseball bats, crowbars, and the guy is more likely to say to the scab, "You're going to cross this picket line over my dead body. And if you take a step across it, you're going to have, Louisville Slugger imprinted on your forehead forever after, because I'm going to crack your head open if you try to cross that picket line." And that's often what happened. So these labor incidents, disputes, were wars, violent, sometimes bloody wars. There are two union groups I want to talk about first, the American Federation of Labor and the American Railway Union. And there were all kinds of other groups. We mentioned earlier in class, in an earlier unit, the Knights of Labor, which died out around this time. But every industry, whether it be steel or textiles, garment workers, had unions. Not every worker had unions, but all those industries did have unions. But this one, the American Federation of Labor, like the Knights of Labor, that it sort of replaced, was an umbrella union. As a federation, what it meant is it took in members, acquired members, sought out members, rejected some for various reasons, of unions of many different industries. So it wasn't just one industry like the steel industry. The AFL became known, short for American Federation of Labor, right? Was an umbrella organization that brought lots of different unions from different industries together. So steel, coal, railroad workers, and on and on and on. And you can see the principle of strength in numbers at work here, at least in theory, because they're trying to, again, sort of make this organization as big as possible by drawing on as many workers as possible. Although, in some other ways, the AFL violated the principle of strength in numbers, as we'll see. A historian I've already quoted saying, "American workers were historically reluctant to join unions. The strong sense of individualism that prevails in American culture militated against it. So did a lack of working class identity among workers. The most successful unions were the craft unions associated with the American Federation of Labor, led by the feisty and tireless Samuel Gompers," who's pictured here on the right. They had the advantage of being skilled workers and on being narrowly focused on higher wages, shorter hours, improved working conditions, and the like. For the large numbers of unskilled workers who felt the need for more dramatic changes, there was no similarly effective organization or voice. So there are a couple of ways in which the American Federation of Labor, under Gomper's leadership, failed to live up to the principle of strength in numbers. And had it done otherwise, it might have been a more successful labor movement. Not that it was a total failure either. But two things, right? It says here in the quote that the AFL was only interested in taking on unions that were in skilled trades or skilled workers themselves. So they didn't want to represent unskilled jobs. So only skilled workers, like cigar makers, which Gompers had been himself, and a skill that's acquired over a long period of time, lots of training involved. The AFL represented those kind of workers and unions, and left the growing numbers, which is the majority, and increasing majority throughout the Gilded Age, of unskilled or low-skilled workers. As the industrial revolution proceeds, more and more of the workforce is unskilled as opposed to skilled. There's another way, and in this sense, they're similar to the populists, farmers of the same era, but they also rejected membership from African American workers and unions, which cost them because they could have achieved a lot more, again, strength in numbers and a broader solidarity had they done so, as well as improved race relations in the country. But in time, there were leaders and unions that came along that did sort of push a more radical labor agenda, and did try to be more inclusive, to live closer to the principle of strength in numbers. And I'm just picking out one union and one leader. There are many others. But Eugene V. Debs is the most famous labor leader of the Gilded Age by far. You see him pictured here. He was a gifted speaker, organizer, writer. He became a socialist over time, and railed against the capitalist system. So he's a good example of radical organized labor, because the AFL, as we just saw, focused on bread and butter issues, which of course are extremely important. Better wages, shorter hours, etc., etc. But leaders like Debs and unions like the one he created, and others that sort of were working for everybody, especially the poorest and least skilled workers, were often trying to change the system. They weren't just working for better wages. They were looking to find ways to end the capitalist system and replace it with socialism. So the radical unions tended to be socialist, or at least anti-capitalist. As the same author I've quoted a few times now relates, perhaps the only ray of hope for organized labor was the success of the Socialist Party. Under the leadership of Eugene V. Debs, the tall, charismatic organizer of the American Railway Union, a rare union that embraced skilled and unskilled workers alike. Debs was a prominent figure in the Pullman strike and was jailed for his efforts, which contributed to his stature in the labor movement. Debs became the most beloved labor leader in the whole country. Traveled back and forth to support this strike and that strike, make speeches at them, wrote again in magazines and newspapers, ran for president, I believe, 4 times, and we'll come back to at least one of the cases in which he did. He lost, of course, the third-party socialist candidate. You might be surprised at how many votes he got, however. And he said at one point, "It has been my life's desire to unify railroad employees and to eliminate the aristocracy of labor, which unfortunately exists, and organize them so all will be on an equality." So why was it his life's desire to organize a railway union? Because he'd started as a railroad worker. As a teenager, he'd worked in the stockyards loading and unloading freight, but eventually kind of graduated and got a job in the union offices as a labor leader, and worked his way up the ranks. But when he first got into the railroad industry and railroad union business, he already saw a blatant violation, the opposite of the strength in numbers principle, because in those days the railroad workers were organized into separate brotherhoods. It was just it was like another word for union. So depending on what job you did on the railroad, you were in a different brotherhood or union. So there was the union of locomotive brakemen, the union of locomotive engineers, the union of locomotive conductors. So if there was a train hurtling down the tracks with 30 employees on it, those 30 employees might belong to 6 different unions. Because you weren't together based on what company you worked for, what industry you were in a brotherhood. It was based on what specific job you did on the railroad. Debs called this an army divided against itself. And it was, and it's clearly what the railroads, the owners, the managers wanted, because they were playing divide and conquer. Keep the workers divided, keep them in separate unions, and they don't have strength in numbers. They can't apply leverage and pressure without strength in numbers. So this is why he was focused on forming a railroad union, and why he talks about it being on an equality, because he wants to go the opposite direction. Debs didn't want rail workers, organized in separate unions based on what they do. He wanted all railroad employees, whatever they did, from unskilled to skilled, in one union to achieve strength in numbers. However, it doesn't say this on the screen. It is true that Debs, though one of maybe the primary organizer, creator of the American Railway Union, or ARU, there was a board, so he was only one vote on the board, and when the time came to vote on racial matters, the board did vote to exclude African Americans from the ARU. So I believe Debs voted in favor of African Americans being involved, partially because I think he was just a fair-minded, decent guy, but he also saw that without it, they would violate the strength in numbers principle. But nonetheless, once again, we see racism getting in the way of strength in numbers. Debs, at one point in his career, wrote, "While there's a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free." Debs, we'll see, actually went to prison twice for sort of living up to his convictions about labor interests. So we're going to look at sort of the big 3 of the labor disputes of the Gilded Age. These are the 3 biggest and most famous. There are many others, but these are the ones that get talked about most in most standard textbooks like ours. Was the Haymarket Affair beneficial or harmful to organized labor? Let's hold on to that question. It's supposed to be in red. This was part of a series of national protests around the country for the 8-hour day. There was no 8-hour day at the time. Workers were still fighting for that, and it took them quite some time after this even to make that law, pressure the U.S. government or get congressmen, supportive of the idea. But at a demonstration of about 600,000 workers at something called the McCormick Reaper Works that made high-tech farm equipment for the day in Chicago, striking workers converged on scabs, causing police to overreact by shooting and clubbing the strikers, which ended up seeing one killed. At a meeting at Haymarket Square the next evening, which was quickly organized, and it was about how to respond to radical leaders. Most of them were anarchists, socialists, making these sort of raucous speeches down with capitalism. But the more specific goal of how we're going to respond to one of our own workers killed the day before. Towards the end of the meeting, as the last speakers were kind of winding down, dozens of police showed up. And just after they showed up, a bomb was sort of lobbed from the crowd, and when it exploded, it killed 7 policemen, several workers, and wounding more than 60 people. To this day, we don't know for sure who threw the bomb. It might have been an anarchist, might have been a striking worker, but we don't know. We don't entirely know. However, there was a trial, and several anarchists that were on the scene that night were tried and convicted of the bombing, even though the evidence was scant, to put it mildly. 3 of those who were found guilty were later had their sentences commuted by the governor of Illinois. But they appear to have been convicted because they were anarchists and little more. Meaning they weren't being convicted based on the evidence or quality of evidence so much as, well, they're anarchists. They're bad guys. They should go to prison. And that was actually a pretty common feeling. Anarchists, if you don't know, believe that sort of it's a very left sort of wing radical stance or philosophy, but they tend to be critical of all government. And to believe that government just doesn't work, and so they basically oppose whatever government they're dealing with at any one time. Not all anarchists are bomb throwers, like we see here. So some anarchists have been peaceful, but some of the more famous ones have also advocated violence and saw it as terrorism as an important part of anarchist left-wing goals. Anarchists and socialists usually can and have in history kind of gotten along, so we see kind of both groups here. So the bomb blast had a tremendous impact on the labor movement. As Richard White, already quoted, says, the bomb blast echoed for more than a decade. A concise and dramatic way to say the Haymarket bombing was a disaster for the labor movement, because to any average American who read about this in the paper, learned about it, again, say white middle class, a key demographic if you were going to get support, to achieve your goals in the labor movement. This was a bad look. Many Americans who might otherwise have sympathized or might have been brought around to sympathizing in time now were turned off by the movement and thought of the labor movement, in many cases, not all, they kind of stereotyped it as the labor movement is a bunch of bomb-throwing radicals, dangerous criminals who are willing to kill innocent people to get what they're demanding. And of course, that's a stereotype and wasn't true, at least overall. Most workers in America, who joined unions were just trying to improve their livelihood, improve their conditions. And certainly the press and the government played this up, and so it's partly because the press and government painted with a broad brush and made such accusations, generalizations, stereotypes that the public sort of came to that conclusion. So it didn't just automatically happen that the American public turned against the workers after the Haymarket incident, but the press and the government helped kind of whip up that kind of response as a way to defeat the labor movement, and it did set it back for about a decade, as White estimates here. We have taught our workers a lesson they will never forget, said Henry Clay Frick, a man we've already met earlier in the class. The Homestead Steel Strike or Lockout of 1893. And my usual question in red print in this PowerPoint, could this be called labor war? I think the answer is clearly yes, as we'll see. So what happened here? Andrew Carnegie and his associates, including Frick, decided to destroy the already existing Amalgamated Steelworkers Union at the Homestead Steel Mill, one of his big steel works. He had accepted the union reluctantly before, but had decided now that it was not in his best interest any longer to do so, so he tried to sort of force a lockout. Interestingly, Carnegie, though he helped to plan the strike, he left for Europe and left Henry Clay Frick, who was the acting manager of the Homestead mill, to manage the strike. So Carnegie took off and left his associate Frick holding the bag. This may have been part of what caused their later falling out, bad blood between them, although it also might have been a deal worked out between the two of them, whereby they could sort of each, sort of plan out ahead of time. Hey, look, if I go to Europe and you're here, we can both kind of point fingers at each other and deflect blame. You can say, hey, Carnegie went to off to Europe, and it's his fault that the workers got treated so badly here. And Carnegie could say, hey, I leave for 1 minute, and you, the manager, sort of let things get out of control. So it's possible that it was sort of a prepared situation, though I don't think we know that for sure. But they successfully got workers to go out on strike, which isn't hard to do, by the way. If you own or manage a company, if you just start cutting workers' pay and doing other things that make their jobs miserable, more and more and more, eventually they go out on strike. So this was the goal: force them out on strike, and then lock them out of the mill, fire them from their jobs, and destroy the union. They weren't just trying to get the workers to agree to quit the union. They were trying to actually destroy it, which they more or less did, because a long, protracted strike usually wears down the resources of a union. Depending on the size of the union, they have limited resources, and one of the things that they'll do in a strike is have use a fund that they have that's for to help keep workers afloat when they're out of work, because the owners aren't going to pay them even on strike. So there's kind of a strike fund which gives the workers an income. It's a fraction of what they would normally get in their wages, but at least it was better than nothing. But after 3 or 4 months, and this strike was that long, that fund goes belly up, or is sort of is very much drained. So this is part of the goal in the first place, is to just deplete the union of resources and wait out the workers. They had Carnegie's company, Carnegie Steel, had already made them a non-negotiable offer, which pegged workers' wages to the price of steel, which they had no choice but to accept at the time. But steel prices have been going down. So Frick said, as the last union contract came up, we're making the same offer again, and that's it. There's nothing else. But that means our wages will be lower this time because the steel prices are low. Yeah, take it or leave it. And they basically decided to leave it, and then Frick had them locked out. So much so, he had a 12-foot high fence, sarcastically referred to as Fort Frick, built around the steel mill, and was already secretly contracting with the Pinkerton Agency to provide armed security. The Pinkertons were a famous detective agency, a little bit misleading. They did more armed security. So you'd hire mercenary guards that would come with guns, sometimes many of them, depending on how many you paid for, and they would help to protect your mill, your factory, etc., etc. But they did this for company after company after company. So Frick was already preparing for really a war. The 12-foot high fence, right? When a worker saw that, if he had any, thought in the back of his mind, well, maybe this won't turn into a strike. Maybe we'll work this out. That couldn't have been reassuring, to put it mildly. Once the workers were locked out, it was clear that they were locked out, it was official they were locked out, they watched over the plant in shifts for scab workers, because they were trying desperately to hold the picket lines, keep scab workers from getting in. I didn't say this earlier when we talked about it, but if scab workers get in and get the plant running, even if they're not as efficient as the workers that are locked out or on strike, because they're not as good at their jobs, they're new at them, even if the plant gets 75% its normal production, that's probably enough to outlast the strikers, because they're still making money. So if you're the strikers on a picket line, if you can, you want 0 or as few as possible scab workers to get in, because you have a better chance of getting what you want, or at least some sort of compromise offer, without the factory being opened back up again. Well, the workers weren't being paranoid and sort of working in shifts to watch out for scabs, because on a given day, 2 barges of Pinkertons, hundreds of them, 2 barges came down the Monongahela River that goes through Pittsburgh, Homestead Works were just outside of Pittsburgh. And as so there were workers on the embankment. They were tipped off ahead of time. So as the barges approached their point of disembarkation, they were fired on by the workers. And a shootout ensued. Dozens were killed or wounded in the end. So this was a battle. And the Pinkertons got the worst of it on this day. They had to actually surrender at one point, come off the boats, and run a gauntlet in which they were beaten. I think a couple of them died from the beatings. Many of them were injured, and some badly from it. Pennsylvania's governor heard about the events, actually heard about it ahead of time because Frick had already sort of alerted him, and sent 8,000 National Guard troops to protect Carnegie's company. The workers at first naively thought that the presence of the National Guard troops would sort of even things out and give them a fighting chance. But it didn't take long for them to realize that they were sent there kind of as, more official versions of the Pinkertons. More training than Pinkerton detectives. They became a strike-breaking force in their own right. If that isn't all confusing enough, wasn't confusing enough for those involved, in the middle of this, a Russian immigrant named Alexander Berkman, an anarchist, who wasn't even part of the strike. He didn't live there, nor didn't even live close to there, but he heard about it because it made national news. And as an anarchist who hated capitalism, as an attempt to strike a blow against capitalism, to kind of, I guess, show solidarity with workers, he went to Pittsburgh, went to the Homestead Mill, and talked his way into Henry Clay Frick's office and tried to assassinate him. Frick was shot twice and stabbed, but didn't die. In fact, he didn't even leave his desk. I think he was trying to make the point that I won't be intimidated out of this job. I want to leave my desk. But while doctors were like removing the bullets from, I forget where they hit him, shoulder, but he just stayed at his desk and worked through it. We've already learned a little bit about Henry Clay Frick, but he's the kind of guy that would do this. A tough customer for sure. But in the end, after 3 months of a bitter strike, much of it through the winter cold months, the strike fund was depleted. The union was basically worn out, and the workers caved and went back to work. The union was destroyed. Union and strike leaders were fired and blacklisted, the latter meaning that you wouldn't find a job at a steel mill ever again if another company, period. You were essentially put on a list of bad guys. Don't hire this guy. He's a troublemaker. He was one of the leaders of the Homestead Steel Strike. So this ended up being brutal. And it's true, as Henry Clay Frick said, to Carnegie, we have taught our workers a lesson they will never forget. Indeed they did, but in an unbelievably harsh way. The Pullman boycott the following year. By this time, the effects of the Depression of 1893 were a partial cause, or make up some of the context for understanding this. Did this strike have a chance? What was Debs thinking? Well, we'll see. So this was the first strike that the brand new American Railway Union that Debs had dreamed of creating got involved in. And the Pullman boycott was the result of a company run or owned by a guy named George Pullman, who treated his workers not so well, and even worse during the Depression. Had a reputation for being a very, very harsh boss indeed. He owned the Pullman Palace Car Company, which made railroad cars, but not just box cars like you see, freight cars like you see in the bottom right, but passenger cars, and usually kind of fancy ones for first-class travel. So he specialized in passenger cars, and he became a successful multimillionaire capitalist. Not as big a player as guys like Rockefeller and Carnegie, but still a big company and lots of money. The H.W. Brands says the nature of the contest between, I should say, the Pullman workers made railroad cars, but they didn't work for a railroad company, right? They made for a company that produced railroad cars. But as their conditions worsened, as Pullman and his executives kept making life more difficult for the workers, partially because the company itself was suffering from the depression, but nonetheless making things intolerable for the workers, they secretly met with the American Railway Union and asked for their help. And there was a debate because this technically wasn't a railroad company, but through Deb's influence, who had visited Pullman and was appalled by the conditions there, he and some of the others got the new union to go along and basically form a sympathy strike with the Pullman workers. Pullman, by the way, was the name of the town where all the workers lived, a company town, which means it was built for the company, kind of around the factories, modestly named after the owner of the company. And if you lived in Pullman, if you worked at the Pullman Palace Car Company, you had to live in Pullman, where all the houses, all the apartments, all the stores, all the churches, all the libraries were owned by George Pullman. So he had the workers certainly over a barrel. So once Debs and the ARU decided to take on the strike, their strategy is jaw-dropping. And this is why Bryan says, the nature of the contest, meaning the conflict, was no secret. While the boycott was ostensibly declared a demonstration of sympathy in behalf of the strikers in the Pullman shops, the New York Times remarked, it in reality will be a struggle between the greatest and most powerful railroad labor organization and the entire railroad capital. Capital means money. Fancy way of saying this is going to be a head-to-head contest between the most powerful railway, or the most powerful railroad union in the country by far, a national one now, and all the railroads in the country. So this is going to be an uphill battle for Debs, the workers, from the start. Yet it was an egregiously unequal fight. The railroads enjoyed the advantage not merely of their much greater financial resources, but of a friendly federal government. Attorney General Richard Olney quickly decided the boycott was illegal, and persuaded a judge to issue an injunction against the ARU boycott. Basically, one judge, federal judge in the Chicago area, where the strike was centered, headquarters was, just issued an injunction saying if 2 or more people meet anywhere to discuss or carry on the strike, that's illegal, which meant the strike was now declared by the federal government illegal by a court. So it stopped it in its tracks. However, in the first several days, say the first week, roughly, the strategy that Debs employed slowed the railway traffic in the whole country by about half. Slowed the rail traffic by half, which must have been staggering to the corporations and to the federal government. Because keep in mind, in those days, there were no semi-trucks. There were no airplanes to carry goods. The way goods were carried to market, at least by land, were the railroads, and it was the major form of transportation, period, on land. So this was a gigantic slowdown of the nation's railways and its interstate trade and commerce. How did they make that happen? Well, the strategy was this. Debs and the rest of the ARU board decided what we're going to do is make it be known across the country that if you are a member of the union, not all rail workers had to be members, but those that were, from San Francisco to New York City and everywhere in between, if you're a worker in the union, card-carrying member, and a train pulls into the station that you're supposed to do your job on, whatever the job is, and it has 1 or more Pullman cars attached to it, you are not to do your job. You say, sorry, boycott. I'm not, if another train comes in, it doesn't have Pullman cars, you can do your job with regard to that train, but not Pullman cars. But this, of course, was why meant you're not going to work on many of the trains that come in, because the Pullman company sold their cars to every railroad. Not all members of the union, right? Remember, not all workers are members of the union, and even some of those who were didn't comply with this, but enough did. That must have been enough. Must have been a large number to be able to slow down the railway traffic nationwide by 1/2. And this is why the federal government was bound to get involved, as was corporate America, because if you slow down the trade and commerce, right, inside of the country by half in a few days, that could be considered a national security issue. Part of what Attorney General Olney was thinking, and probably really believed, that we can't allow this. It's dangerous for the country, and it might have been. So it does show that, I think, back to our red question at the top, did this strike have a chance? The answer, I think, is no. It's possible that Debs was just trying to send a message. Other leaders were trying to send a message saying, hey, look, we can, look what we can do. Look what we just did to your railroad system. We crippled it for a number of days. And if we get bigger and the next strike is larger, next time we might do more damage to you. You might want to, keep that in mind. Well, keep it in mind they did. Government, corporate leaders, railroad executives, but kept it in mind by thinking about ways to sort of fight back effectively. And the second question, what was Debs thinking? Well, it might have been that we're going to send a message to them even though we're going to lose. Because if it wasn't that, the strike was reckless, indeed, because it had little, maybe no chance of succeeding. Eventually, federal troops were sent in when the injunction was violated. Debs himself violated it and was tried and put in prison for it. He was arrested right away. So with him gone, the thing kind of petered out. But before it was all over, workers and rioters burned railroad cars, broke windows, caused huge damage, property damage, put people in danger by so much arson going on. Federal troops ended up firing on workers and rioters and looters. More than a dozen were killed, 60 wounded on both sides. Again, I said Debs was arrested. The strike collapsed. As one source says, as satisfying as the destruction may have been to the primal urges of the mob, the violence proved a public relations disaster for the ARU. Public comment almost universally condemned the rioters and the strikers. So once again, a PR disaster like the Haymarket affair. Basically, the whole country's a response to this was horror at what the workers had done, not what the capitalists had done.